Hello everyone, welcome back to part 2 of the debates between me, Trace Cruz, aka Alterra Training, and then of course Logan Allen, one of the parts of Stronghold, Health and Performance, right? Health and Performance, I always get it wrong. Stronghold Health and Performance. Hopefully you enjoyed the last episode. If you enjoy this one, but you haven't seen the last one, definitely go check that one out. It's going to be a similar format. Pretty much we've come up with a handful of questions that are pretty much like commonly asked questions. Maybe not necessarily like in the general public, but definitely stuff that we talk about often in the exercise science and strength and conditioning world. So yeah, if you enjoy this one, definitely go back and watch the previous one that just came out last week. With that being said, you ready to get rolling?
I'm ready. Let's get going.
All right, so basically we have a handful of prompts here. I'm just basically going to read the prompt. I'll basically act as the host, and Logan will be first to respond to the prompt. He'll basically respond in the positive or the negative, and definitely give some rationale behind his thought process. And then I'll come in after him and kind of take the opposing view. Probably just as often though, I'll just be supporting what he says and just adding a little bit more nuance to it. So again, this is kind of, as Logan said, I think he said it last episode, maybe it was before we were rolling though, this is really just a way to kind of play devil's advocate and just help you guys kind of have a little bit more understanding behind all of the issues that we're talking about and really just adding nuance to them. So without further ado, Logan, what is pre-hab and does it have a role in a strength and conditioning program? Moreover, does static stretching deserve a role in most strength and conditioning programs?
So pre-hab is the general concept of training to prevent injury. It's kind of the antithesis of rehab, which is training after an injury to help build the athlete back better, bigger, stronger. In general, I think the focus on prehab is probably a little overrated. I think people really should just start programming better. I think that prehab and good training should kind of just be synonymous. And then I'll go ahead and answer static stretching, and then I'll dive back in a little bit more. I think that static stretching for most strength and conditioning teams is also probably overrated. I don't think that most strength and conditioning programs or most team sports need extra mobility. Obviously, stretching still has its place if an athlete has a severe limitation. But within the strength and conditioning program, athletes should be doing a full range of motion exercise, which will help improve or maintain their range of motion. Obviously, it won't help improve their range of motion potentially as much as purely static stretching. But for most team sports, it's more than enough. Unless, of course, you're doing gymnastics or any other sport that needs a very wide range of motion where you may need to spend some time deliberately static stretching to increase that range of motion.
Yeah.
Which I think.
So give us a little bit more context, like what might some prehab exercises or prehab workout session look like, just so the listeners kind of understand. Like, are you saying that any type of exercise that you would see in a PT clinic does not belong in strength and conditioning, or kind of give a little bit more context to that?
So prehab still, like, it has its place, but I think I think it should be synonymous with good programming. So exercises you would see in a PT clinic do still have their place, and as long as we can still apply progressive overload. I think that's one of the primary things that we need to focus on is, can we apply progressive overload to this exercise? So if we're doing like a prehab exercise that, I'm trying to think of a good example now, I'm kind of blanking.
Like maybe some short external rotations or something like that.
Yeah, so if we're doing external rotations, as long as we can maybe gradually increase the weight, or if we're just doing it as like a warm-up, that's great. I think the mobility prep and the movement prep is where we can fit in a lot of these exercises. even if we can't add progressive overload, or maybe we don't want to. I mean, every time we do a set of bench press, or at least we probably start with just the bar, and then add weight, maybe do a second warm-up set, add a little bit more weight, and then we progress up to our working weight from there. I think we can treat a lot of these pre-hab exercises kind of the same way, where maybe we'll do our external rotations, or maybe do some like Cuba presses where we do like a face pull and press overhead before a bench press to warm up the rotator cuff, warm up the shoulders, make sure everything feels nice and warm prior to our main exercise. In general, prehab exercises as well try to take so they look at a sport. So let's say soccer, for example. They look at the primary injuries that occur within that sport, such as like ACL or knee injuries, and they kind of work backwards to prevent that injury from occurring. So they might do a lot of lunges and side lunges and some single leg work, as well as just like back squatting and stuff to build up the strength of the knee to hopefully prevent a lot of these non-contact injuries. A little caveat, a lot of people do get confused, the non-contact and contact injuries. I'm in no way saying we're going to prevent contact injuries. That's just something that's going to happen with sports. If we get tackled and our knee bends sideways, there's not much you can do to prevent an injury there. But if we are adequately strengthening the muscles that are responsible for providing that movement, maybe it's a lateral cut in soccer, hopefully we can prevent most of those non-contact injuries that are just them moving without any other opponents or anything. Did that answer your question?
Yep, that's good.
Sweet.
All right, so I'm taking basically the positive, that is prehab does deserve a role in a strength and conditioning program, and so does static stretching. So Logan definitely hit the nail on the head with, if you're gonna include some prehab type stuff, then probably, at least in my opinion, and probably his and many others, is to go ahead and just kind of build that into the warm-up. So as he said, the bench press example, if you want to do some face pulls, some shoulder external rotations, internal rotations, whatever it may be, targeting the main joint of that, the primary training stimulus that you're going to have that day, would be a very good place to go ahead and put your prehab exercises. Really, with this topic, we're kind of getting into fuzzy areas of like, what is prehab, what is a warm-up, what is potentiation, are we actually targeting muscles, are we targeting movement patterns? So this whole question is kind of vague. We definitely love to get PTs and chiropractors, athletic trainers on the show, and we definitely will in the future to address this question as well, because ultimately our kind of niche is still strength and conditioning and human performance. Logan definitely has an affinity toward that clinical side. I don't really have a strong affinity toward the clinical side, but I do have a strong affinity toward the actual program side, like program development. So yeah, in that context, some prehab exercises that are going to target either weaknesses or that primary joint, primary movement patterns of that day could definitely have a place. For me personally, I really don't do that. I'm trying to think through my own training. Like when I warm up, if I'm in the gym, if it's weight training, I'm just gonna do whatever exercises I do, just lighter, and then build up to my working load. Sometimes I'll do some form of like potentiation, like if I'm doing bench press, maybe I'll do some clapping push-ups or something, or just speed bench press. But even that's pretty rare. That's probably just once every couple weeks. That's just me. I just really don't feel like that helps me a lot. For some people, it definitely does help them a lot though. One of my training partners, we kind of give him a hard time because he spends 20 to 30 minutes warming up. A lot of that is because he has a little bit more of an injury history. He also just feels way better when he has a warm-up. So again, this stuff kind of gets fuzzy. Is it prehab? Is it a warm-up? I think I can say that in that context, prehab deserves a place. However, if you're designing a whole program around prehab, so as Logan said, if you have a team of soccer players, if your whole program is built around preventing a knee injury by doing prehab type exercises, you're probably not optimizing your program. Again, not that should not belong anywhere in it. However, if we're gonna really focus on some sort of unstable knee flexion, knee extension, whatever it may be, exercise over actually doing like a compound lift, a squat, some sort of jump, some plyometrics, whatever it may be, we're probably a little bit off track and we're not really getting the most bang for our buck. Again, not that prehab doesn't deserve a place, it's just having an actual prehab program for most athletes is probably not necessary. So for static stretching, I'm kind of forced to say that it does deserve a role in most strength and conditioning programs. So the ACSM, which is probably the largest entity in our field, it dwarfs the NSCA, which we would generally kind of subscribe to a little bit more on the most part from the strength and conditioning perspective. So the ACSM, the American College of Sports Medicine, they very highly recommend flexibility training for basically everybody. And while I don't necessarily agree that basically recommending for everybody is the same as including it in a strength and conditioning program, clearly the ACSM sees some benefit in static stretching. So I'll go ahead and say that static stretching does play a role and can increase range of motion, maybe reduce injury risk. I would be very hesitant to say that. I would say it's more likely to reduce injury risk than to increase injury risk, but I certainly would not count on it for reducing injury risk. However, something that kind of hits a little close to home for me is whenever I run ultra marathons, I pretty much always cramp, and I've seen more than a handful of studies that show that individuals who have like a actual stretching plan that actually subscribe to it over the long term are less likely to have those exercise-associated muscle cramps. So there's a little bit of evidence for the benefits of cramping, or benefits of static stretching, sorry. Maybe static stretching is gonna help you get through a slightly greater range of motion during your dynamic work. So if you're doing some static stretching before you're doing your full range of motion squats, maybe that full range of motion is gonna be a little bit greater. I would suspect probably it would be a little bit. However, truth is, I really don't static stretch much at all. And I definitely think that, especially in the strength and power realm, if you're stretching before your workout, it's probably going to take a little bit away from your workout. At the same time, probably not quite as much as we once thought maybe 5 or 6 years ago. We saw evidence that it was drastically impairing the stretch sorting cycle of the neuromuscular system, basically. We now know that that's probably true, but it's probably kind of up to personal preference. So if you're an elite athlete, I would probably stay away from static stretching before power training. But if you're kind of just a casual gym goer and you want to do a warm-up and then you want to do some static stretching and then you want to do some prehab and then you want to do your box jumps, then you're probably fine. You feel like we covered that question pretty well?
Yeah, as you were saying stuff, I had a few points, but then you answered them. So,
okay.
So we're all set.
All right, on to the next.
On to the next.
All right, what is the risk of hypo and hypernatremia? So basically, overhydration and underhydration, hyponatremia being too low of a sodium concentration in the blood, and hypernatremia being too high of a sodium concentration in the blood. So what is the risk of that in sport? And then are electrolyte supplements essential?
Okay, so I think that electrolyte supplements are essential in sport, assuming the athletes are consuming a healthy diet. So if the athletes are consuming a very unhealthy diet full of very processed foods that are full of like sugar, fat, and salt, I'm thinking like Rice Krispie treats, Pop-Tarts, they all have a ton of sodium in it, whether you realize it or not. If they're eating an unhealthy diet, chances are they don't need an electrolyte supplement. However, what we see a lot of, or very frequently, is when athletes are eating a very healthy diet full of minimally processed foods, high quality protein, fruits and vegetables, they're typically not getting very much sodium. So if they have a very intense practice, especially in a very warm environment, they'll lose a lot of electrolytes due to sweating. So in that scenario, I think electrolyte supplements are essential because we need to replenish that sodium. And having our sodium levels too low can result in pretty severe consequences. Anecdotally speaking, I've had my sodium levels drop really low twice, and I woke up in the hospital both times. So maybe I have a little bit of bias towards that because I have a traumatic background considering low sodium levels. But either way, I do think that electrolyte supplements can be a very good thing, and they can benefit a lot of athletes, especially if they're eating a very healthy diet. Yeah, I'll pass the torch to you.
Sounds good. I'll go, and then as per usual, I'll spark some thoughts in Logan's mind, and then he'll definitely have an opportunity to answer. So, risks with hypo and hypernatremia. Hyponatremia in our sport of ultra running is very, very common. Basically, the way that this happens is if individuals consume too much, basically just too much water with no electrolytes, specifically no sodium along with that. So just because they're not drinking electrolyte supplements obviously does not mean that they're not getting sodium. They could obviously get sodium through their diet. So if they're eating while running and then they're drinking water, then they're probably getting enough sodium. But what happens with hyponatremia is, of course, the decrease in blood sodium, which it ultimately reflects the decrease in sodium throughout the whole body. So if you have low blood sodium, it's likely that your muscles have low sodium, and this can, of course, lead to cramps. However, the more likely presentation, the more likely symptoms that you're going to experience with hyponatremia would be stuff like lightheadedness and confusion, definitely some nausea. It's going to be stuff that is much more systemic and not necessarily as peripheral. Again, certainly there is pathology that would defend the fact that low sodium would cause muscle cramps, basically heat cramps. I have done a pretty deep dive into the muscle cramp side, and I've seen that actually most muscle cramps in the sporting environment would be considered exercise-associated muscle cramps and not heat cramps. And they know this because in individuals who have muscle cramps, they don't really show any decrement or decrease or subnormal values in blood sodium or muscle sodium. So it's really actually unlikely that electrolyte loss is actually causing your muscle cramps, specifically in those higher intensity sports. If we're talking really long duration stuff, like true ultra marathons, even in this context, probably 100 miles or longer, where your body really has time to actually lose a lot of electrolytes, or if you're just a really, really salty sweater, this can happen as well. However, statistically, it actually seems like most cramps have very little, if anything, to do with losing sodium. So since Logan took the positive that electrolyte supplements are essential, I'm saying this because I'm saying that they're not essential, which I kind of believe. Obviously, there are very important situations in which they are important. I certainly take them, even since I've read the evidence to say that plasma sodium concentration is not correlated with cramping. I still think it's better safe than sorry. It's still probably not going to hurt you. However, I will say if you are just kind of a recreational gym goer, if you go for a 5K jog a couple days a week and you hit the gym a couple days a week, you're potentially putting yourself at risk if you're consuming something like an element or something with that higher sodium concentration. Again, in the sporting context, an element is one of the best brands out there. There's a whole bunch of good brands. But I think that there can be a risk for other people, people who don't really train as hard, that are just taking a hit of a whole gram. So they have 1,000 milligrams of sodium, and if they're not really losing sodium, you add that 1,000 milligrams into the few thousand that they're probably consuming in their diet anyway, and you can start to put together a situation in which individuals develop hypertension. That's very much a conversation for another time. I'm certainly not saying that these supplements are bad, but again, I'm kind of forced to take the negative here. One more point, and then I'll throw this back to Logan. Electrolyte supplements are actually one of the most beneficial, most life-saving medical interventions that we've ever come up with. Basically behind like sanitation and some of the major antibiotics, electrolyte supplements, especially in like third world countries, and obviously more particularly really hot environments, electrolyte supplementation has been one of the biggest basically life-saving tools that the medical community has ever come up with. So I know I kind of threw a lot out there. There might be a lot for you to kind of sift through. Again, all this stuff is context dependent, so I'm very much okay saying that electrolyte supplements in sport are overrated. All right, Logan, you got anything?
Yeah, I think one of the caveats that you made was really important, so I kind of want to highlight that again. Most general population people probably aren't sweating enough, whether they're running 2 or 3 times a week, go to the gym 2 or 3 times a week, to really justify needing an electrolyte supplement, because they probably are getting enough from food and they're not sweating that much throughout the week. Of course, if those 2 to 3 runs are midday in the summer when it's 103 degrees and 100% humidity and you're just profusely sweating, that may be a context in which you may need it. But for the vast majority of general population, like you said, you probably don't really need the electrolytes. I think the important thing is the strength and conditioning professional or the athlete, in which they are, maybe they have 2 or 3 lifts a week and they have 5 or 6 different practices a week where they're high intensity, they're sweating, they're putting 100% effort. That'd be the case where I would probably start encouraging them to take an electrolyte supplement pretty regularly, at least if I know their diet as well. And I do think it's important as well to maybe track the diet for a week or 2, maybe just to get a baseline. I don't think most people need to do it consistently, just because that could get relatively overwhelming trying to track every single thing. But if you can be really diligent and track everything you consume for maybe a week or 2, you can get a pretty good idea about how much sodium you're getting on average and make an educated decision from there. Because if you're getting enough sodium, chances are you don't need the electrolyte beverage. But if you track your diet for 1 to 2 weeks and you're like, oh wow, I'm hardly getting any sodium, and especially if you start feeling any of the symptoms like Trace alluded to, like the lightheadedness, dizzy, like low blood pressure type symptoms, then it may be beneficial to maybe start to consider an electrolyte supplement then. But once again, if we're getting enough sodium, adding more on top probably isn't a good idea, because it does put us at a higher risk of hypertension or high blood pressure.
Yep. All right, and obviously, as you guys know, we're just kind of spitballing our thoughts here. This stuff is always context dependent, so don't say, oh, Trace said that electrolyte supplements are kind of overhyped, and then just totally ignore any benefit that they may have. Same thing with the pre-hab, same thing with everything else. That being said, this one I do have some strong opinions on. I didn't tell you my opinions beforehand, so you obviously don't change what you say based on me. So this one's obviously gonna, as soon as I say it, people are gonna probably find themselves very much in one camp or the other. Do ice baths live up to the hype? And if so, when should they be implemented?
Okay, so ice baths are all the rage right now. I see probably at least one ice bath every time I open my Instagram. They are extraordinarily prevalent in our community currently. That being said, I think that ice baths require a lot of nuance and a lot of context, because in my opinion, there's a lot of cases where ice baths can be a great tool, but I think there's several scenarios in which they can be a hindrance as well. I guess this question isn't necessarily phrased for a positive or negative. Should I just say my opinion?
Yeah, just say your opinion. We'll both just give our opinions because, as you said, there's a lot of nuance here, as with most of these questions. But we'll both just give our opinions, and then hopefully you guys respond with angry messages or whatever.
Whatever gets the algorithm going. So, the context in which I want to specify first would be the normal training stimulus, whether that's performance, hypertrophy, such as like bodybuilding, whatever. Taking an ice bath directly after the training stimulus has been shown to blunt some of the benefits of exercise. So, exercise is an inflammatory response. Our body sends a cascade of signals and hormones in this form of inflammation to signal our muscles to adapt, grow, get bigger, stronger, faster. That being said, ice baths are really great because they are anti-inflammatory, which is great if you have constant inflammation. However, ice baths, because they're anti-inflammatory, will cancel out the inflammatory aspects of exercise, and it'll kind of be like a net zero. So you may have just spent an hour and a half working out, max intensity, maybe gassed. If you take an ice bath right after, you could have just sat at home. That being said, that's immediately after. I think that ice baths can help with recovery significantly if you take it later in the day. So I think in most literature that I've seen, it says upwards of 4 hours. So if you finish working out at noon, maybe don't take an ice bath until at least 4 p.m. What I've heard is later the better. So if you can wait even longer or further away from the exercise stimulus, will probably be better just in case to not disrupt any of those signals. The other kind of branch I want to go into is in the context of a competition or a tournament. So we'll go back to that soccer example. If you're on a soccer team and you have a tournament, you have maybe 3 games today, 3 games tomorrow, and like another 3 games. Like that's a packed schedule. An ice bath may be really great for immediately canceling out the effects of that exercise stimulus or the game, allowing you to feel much more recovered going into the next game. In the context of a tournament, we're not necessarily looking to get better, we're looking to maintain. So I think in that context, ice baths can be a great tool because they will help reduce that fatigue so that we can perform just as well during our next game when maybe the athletes on the other team are a little bit more fatigued because they didn't take an ice bath. But that being said, context is the most important. If we want to benefit from our training stimulus, maybe wait. But if you want to get rid of fatigue as soon as possible, go ahead and hop in the ice bath.
Yep. So reminder, this is always in the context, unless we specify otherwise, which we already have a couple times this episode, generally in the context of strength and conditioning. So we're not really going to talk about mental toughness or sleep optimization, any of that stuff, mostly because there hasn't been a ton of good research on it. Also, that stuff is one reason there hasn't been a ton of good research is it's really hard to actually measure and quantify and or qualify. So I'm going to address both topics that Logan said and then provide a little bit more. So what he was saying initially about doing an ice bath shortly after a training session, specifically resistance training, there is what I would just consider to be conclusive evidence that shows that ice bath shortly after resistance training blunts muscle protein synthesis, which is just a different way of saying the anti-inflammation effects and anti-inflammatory effects of the ice bath are drastically going to reduce any potential muscle protein synthesis. That being said, I haven't seen any evidence that it's going to reduce strength or power or endurance from any exercise, so it's not going to probably blunt any of those responses. However, it seems very conclusive again that ice baths shortly after resistance training is going to basically interrupt that cascade of effects that causes muscle protein synthesis, which is what causes muscles to grow. And most of us, even if our main purpose of being in the gym isn't to grow muscle, that's generally going to be something that we all desire anyway. And then second aspect, kind of during competition, long competition weekends, ice bath may have a place. However, there was a study that recently came out within the last year. I don't remember exactly when it was. I think it was 2023, but late 2023. They basically compared ice bath, percussion, and then just passive rest after an exhaustive exercise bout. And they determined that at various different time points within 72 hours, that there was no difference in jumping performance, creatine kinase, which is a marker of muscle damage, or subjective feelings from any of the interventions, and that obviously includes ice baths. So definitely what we learned in school is very much what Logan said. If you're actually kind of in the midst of competition, it can definitely help reduce fatigue and maybe increase recovery. Even those two words, fatigue and recovery, those deserve a whole podcast on their own, because whatever you've been talking about here. However, a lot of people do feel much better just subjectively after an ice bath. So I would wager that actual physiological recovery doesn't really happen from ice baths basically anywhere throughout your program, throughout your day, throughout your week, whatever it is. However, you likely will feel a little bit better. Yes, there may be reduced inflammation from it. I would speculate that that probably is the case. However, inflammation probably is not actually really inhibiting your exercise performance unless it's to severe levels. So I would even wager to say that ice baths during competition weekend, if the athlete really wants to do it, maybe let them do it. But even then, probably just some active and passive recovery. Good hydration, good food is going to go a lot further. Yeah, I think that's probably good to answer this question. Again, we're just talking the strength and conditioning, basically the recovery aspect. There are aspects of cold plunges, ice baths that people swear by. A lot of subjective stuff helps some people, hurts some people. I personally don't like it. Certainly one's attitude toward a specific behavior or a specific activity is going to affect the outcome of it. So that's probably one reason why I don't think they're that beneficial, mostly because I don't like it. Yeah, the feeling after is nice, but in my opinion, that's pretty negligible in the grand scheme of things. If you want that feeling, you can just do like 10 burpees and you'll feel basically the same way. Yeah, you have any final thoughts on this, Logan?
Yeah, I think a large portion of recovery is kind of the mindset that the athlete has around it too. Like you were kind of alluding to at the end there. Sometimes if we go into it, like we take an ice bath and we just feel great afterwards, even if there may not be any physiological changes per se, and we might not actually perform better on any of these tests, whether it's the jumping or the creatine kinase like you said, if the athlete feels better, chances are they'll perform better too. So, and this is the area in which we get tied up a lot, like the recovery literature, is a lot of stuff really does seem to be a placebo, but at the end of the day, the placebo effect is still an effect. It still works, and if the athlete goes into the next game being like, I feel great, let's go run through a wall, chances are they'll perform better than if they're sitting there thinking, man, I just played a game, I don't feel that great, like am I retired, like hopefully I can do this. And I think the mindset going into the game can influence the outcomes greatly, even if there's not that physiological difference.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's any.
No, definitely agree with that. Yeah, I'm just coming at it more from, obviously I admitted my bias is in the real world actually against ice baths, but also being a scientist, looking at the data, even the subjective data is very much hit or miss. But again, Logan knows this, I know it. Hopefully a lot of you guys, if you don't already know it, this will kind of trigger your thought process. Whenever you're actually reading research, they're really only gonna report the norms. They're only gonna report the averages. So if half the people find it to be a great benefit, half the people find it to be a great detriment, the average is going to be it didn't do anything. And that's a major, I hate to say it's a flaw in research. It's kind of just the nature of research when you're taking a sample and you're trying to extrapolate it to basically everybody or everyone else who would fit kind of within that theoretical sample. You really do have to report the averages. It's really unrealistic to expect the authors to report the changes in every individual person. However, that's really how this stuff should be done. You should read research, look at the theory behind it, look at the sample size, figure out, like, is this something that theoretically would work with my athlete? And then if you think it would work, then try to implement it with them. If it works, great. If not, move on. So that's kind of hopefully some context really to everything that we talked about. But I would say specifically when we have something that is so subjective, i.e. fatigue, recovery, and then what falls under that ice bath, that concept is super, super important. So for me, I don't think ice baths are very beneficial at all. I think they're actually a net negative. For other people, certainly we know plenty of people who do enjoy them. All right, next question. Does fasting for any length of time offer any health or fitness benefits? If you want to add nuance to this, like if you want to talk about intermittent fasting, 24-hour fasting, just say so, and then we'll go based off that.
Yeah, so there is a difference between, well, let me back up a step. First, I want to kind of expand upon the difference of like health and performance. So the thing that we do for health or longevity may not be the same thing we do for maximizing performance in a certain athletic task. For like a good example of this would be if someone's asking me about nutrition for longevity, I probably wouldn't recommend them eating Sour Patch Kids. At the same time, if they're about to go to a powerlifting meet and they need as much blood sugar as they can to perform as well as they can, I'll be like, sure, eat some Sour Patch Kids. Like, we want to top your blood sugars off. Like, let's go for it. All that to say, there is a difference between health and performance. I think fasting kind of falls in that same category of we may not necessarily want to fast if we're trying to maximize performance because, once again, blood sugar is crucial for performance. We need that rapid energy to run, sprint, lift, whatever our desired athletic performance is. And if we don't have enough blood sugar, it's going to be much harder to perform those various athletic movements. The antithesis of that, though, is that fasting for health can provide a good amount of benefits, especially if you're trying to lose weight. However, a lot of the research I've seen shows that's no more effective than a caloric deficit. So I do want to expand a little bit more on that point, and that so in this context, a caloric deficit would be anywhere, say you're burning 3,000 calories a day, you would eat slightly less than that. What I've seen is that fasting essentially does the same thing, just by the nature of it. If we're not eating as often, or we're condensing the time in which we're eating, it's going to be hard to get enough calories in. So this is where the psychological aspect can kind of come into play. The grand scheme of things, in my opinion, for health is what can we stick to the best. So if you find it much easier to eat 5 or 6 small meals a day and still be in a caloric deficit, or maybe 3 meals like breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but still be in a caloric deficit, great. If you can't stand that because you're like, oh, I'm like hungry after every meal, I want to eat more, then maybe like something like intermittent fasting would be a great option, because you can do like a 16-8, so you're fasting for 16 hours, eating for 8 hours, but you can only get maybe like 2 or 3 meals in during that time, and you're going to feel really full, but still manage to be in a caloric deficit because you're only eating that short window. Yeah, that's I'm sure as you start saying something,
Yep.
more stuff will pop in my head.
For sure. So let's kind of roll with this 16-8 intermittent fasting for two main reasons. A, because there was a period in time when I did this for about a year, and B, it's just most realistic for most people. I'll go ahead and mention one of the biggest benefits to longer fasting, which is supposed autophagy, which is basically your body is going to catabolize any basically damaged cells, and you're theoretically going to use those materials to build new cells. This is really important when we're talking about like cancer and other basically conditions in which poor cellular health is the main driver. So there is evidence that autophagy does exist. It does spike, I think around 24 hours is what I've seen most prevalently. However, the trigger for that seems to be AMP kinase, which is really just a cellular sensor that measures low energy availability within the cells. And it seems very likely that we could get that same stimulus just through hard exercise or really exercise in general, still stimulate autophagy through that. That's still definitely being fleshed out. I'm not saying that that's off the table, that is unimportant or unrelated to anything health or fitness related. But we're going to kind of put that aside for now just because it's still pretty inconclusive. Yes, autophagy is a good thing. However, we probably don't need to fast in order to get it. We're probably doing it right now as we speak. So the 16-8 fast, so you're fasting for 16 hours and then you have an 8-hour feeding window. This was a really, really beneficial strategy for me to lose weight. As Logan was alluding to, all that really matters with weight loss or weight gain is calories in, calories out. So if you eat more than you burn, you're gonna gain weight. If you burn more than you eat, you're gonna lose weight. So there's nothing magic about fasting. It really is just you're constraining time, and then therefore you're constraining calories through the amount of time that you can eat. So this is not foolproof. Like, you can absolutely only eat, and even in an extreme case, and you can only eat in a 1-hour window and still easily consume more calories than you're gonna burn throughout that day. So the theory basically goes, if you limit it to an 8-hour window and you eat whole foods and only eat to satiation, then you're probably gonna be in a deficit. And that's what I did, and that's what worked for me. However, again, definitely nothing special, nothing woo-woo or magical about fasting. I do think that fasting, probably from that perspective, is good. The potential autophagy, increased autophagy, even at that 16 hours, is probably higher than baseline. Moreover, even from the performance side, it's probably not actually that bad. It's certainly not optimal. As Logan said, higher blood sugars, just higher nutrient availability in general is good. However, if you time your workouts right, you're probably going to be fine on that 16-8. Moreover, if we're talking about protein, what really seems to matter is your total protein. When you consume protein, your blood amino acids are going to basically get up to a certain level, and then your muscles are going to extract amino acids from your blood to build muscle, but those amino acids in your blood are going to stay elevated for a long time. So we used to look at muscle protein synthesis in the muscle and look at the cellular cascade, cellular signals that represent muscle protein synthesis, and we would see that those would kind of come down various timescales, but generally, depends what you're looking at, but various timescales. But actually consuming a high amount of protein, when we look at the blood amino acids, they're actually going to stay elevated for hours and hours. So it's nowhere near as important as we once thought to do that 5 or 6 meals a day of protein intake, at least for the muscle hypertrophy standpoint. You got anything else, Logan?
Yeah, this is slightly off topic, but I just wanted to highlight the importance of protein. If we're in a caloric deficit, a lot of times what we'll see is people in a caloric deficit who are not exercising will lose a lot of muscle mass as well as fat mass. One of the ways we can offset that, or there's 2 ways we can offset losing our muscle mass while in a caloric deficit. Exercising is a huge driving factor. If we're exercising and in a caloric deficit, whether it's via just a strict caloric deficit or intermittent fasting, we can help maintain that protein or the muscle mass. The second thing, I'm getting ahead of myself there, is protein. So exercising, getting enough protein can help us maintain the muscle mass despite losing weight and being in a caloric deficit. So it can help bias fat loss rather than muscle loss, which is very important. We want to maintain muscle mass as much as we can.
Yep.
Yeah.
On to the next.
On to the next.
All right, so this is actually the last one. This is the only one that I actually told Logan I wanted to take a specific stance on. Should most people wear and follow the data that devices that track sleep, heart rate variability, heart rate, predict heart rate max, etc.? So for me, I wear a Garmin Fenix 6. Whoop is one of the biggest ones in this industry. Biggest, and as far as I've seen from the research, they are the best when it comes to these metrics. There's a ton of other brands, Fitbit, Apple Watch, any of this stuff that gives biometrics, basically derives information based on your heart rate. Some of them take body temperature. Obviously things like tracking steps, estimating calorie burn, all this stuff. Are these useful for most people, and should the metrics actually be followed? So I'm gonna let Logan go, but before then, just so that I can make sure I tie it down, I am very much taking the negative on this, even though I do love these devices. I love my Garmin Fenix 6. It helps a lot with a lot of things. However, I think that it can be misleading in a lot of areas. So Logan, what are your personal thoughts on this stuff?
So obviously I'm taking the positive here in the fact that a lot of these devices are good and should be used. I think that comparatively, even like 5-10 years ago, these devices have come a long way. I mean, even in the last 5 years, most watches didn't do HRV, and now basically every smartwatch you can buy measures HRV. Some even do EKG, which is just kind of crazy that we have that capability now. I think that a lot of these things can be great tools, especially in terms of HRV. So HRV is a measure of the variability in between our heartbeat, or every time our heart beats. So like, this is a little bit counterintuitive to a lot of people, is that we want our HRV to be really high. So we want to have a large amount of variability between every beat, so it's not like a metronome. If our heart beats like a metronome, that's a really low HRV, and that's typically a signal that we're maybe getting sick, or overtraining, under recovering, any of those things. So HRV is a measure of sympathetic nervous system activity, and the sympathetic nervous system is anything but sympathetic. It's the flight or fight system, and that's what causes our heart rate to be more metronome-like. Whereas parasympathetic is the rest and digest. When that is more amplified comparatively to sympathetic, that's when we'll have a really high HRV. So the goal is to increase our HRV. And I think a lot of these watches and wearables are getting progressively better and better at giving us accurate data and comparing it to previous numbers. At the very least, a lot of these devices are becoming reliable, maybe not lab grade accurate, but they're very consistent, and I think that we can use these numbers to maybe determine what we do for training. So using resting heart rate, HRV, sleep quality, sleep quantity, any of these variables that the wearables can tell us, we can use to influence our training. So maybe if our HRV is super low one day, maybe we'll take a light day. Maybe if we got really bad sleep one night, we try to make an extra effort to get really good sleep the following night. That being said, and even though I am taking the positive, I do want to kind of put a caveat, a little nuance here, is that wrist-based measurements do not tend to be super accurate, and we probably should, to Trace's point, use these numbers with a grain of salt. Just because, once again, it's on the wrist, it's not a center, like chest mounted device. And so there's a lot of potential that it could go wrong. Once again, like if our watch is twisted, if it's too loose, if it's in a different spot, even like freckles and tattoos can cause some of these variables to be skewed. So once again, I think they're a great useful tool. Treat it with a grain of salt. So one thing I'll do personally is, like, I'll look at what my watch says my HRV is and say, like, oh, it'll give me a little scale of like, oh, good, maybe bad, take another day of rest, to like, great, you're doing, like, do whatever you want to do today. But I won't necessarily let it influence my training unless I'm also feeling bad. So I'll take a mental note of like, how am I feeling today? Am I feeling good? Am I recovered? And then I'll look at my HRV and to see if that agrees with me. So if my psychology is kind of telling me take a rest day, and then my HRV is kind of giving me the data to take a rest day, that's when maybe I would take a rest day rather than, oh man, I feel great, like let's crush it today. And then like I look at my watch and it's like, take a rest day. I'm like, well, there's a discrepancy there. Maybe don't take a rest day if you're feeling great. So treat it with a grain of salt, and I guess double check. But
yeah, so that's obviously a good place in which subjective measures are going to be more important than objective. The place that my mind goes when he was talking about that is if you feel really bad, and your HRV is really bad, all that's really doing is confirming what you already know. I really don't think there's any physiological metric that should be given the weight, given more weight than the way that you feel. This might be true in some cases, specifically for individuals who are really just type A, really just go-getters, and their watch says they're good and they're good to go. And I do know people like that for sure. However, most people who are really good athletes train really hard. They really know their bodies really, really well. And oftentimes they don't need their watch to tell them that they're feeling bad. They already know they're feeling bad. Moreover, I'm not really convinced that HRV should be used to actually change if you work out or not. Maybe it should change the intensity and the volume of your workout. Even there, it's really going to depend what the rest of your plan looks like. I'm going to make a quick kind of point and then go back to the start of where my mind was going. If HRV is always increased, is always good. So right now, I just checked my watch this morning. It said my HRV is right at 100, which is pretty good. A lot of well-trained endurance athletes, when they're fully recovered, will be up to even like 120. A lot of people, especially if you're unhealthy, I mean, you can be in the 50s, you can even be in the 40s, and you'll be fine overall. It's just really not a marker of health if you're that low. Like, it's probably not a healthy thing. So as Logan said, higher generally better. So if you're always functioning at a high HRV, if you're always recovered, really that means you're not training hard enough. Because if you're not taking an HRV hit, you're not training hard enough. Because the only way that the body knows to adapt is if you're actually training hard enough to, if you're actually eliciting enough of a stressor in order to induce a response. So long-term, yeah, HRV tracking might be beneficial, but if your HRV is low, it's very, very likely that that's just because you had a really hard training day the day before. So it's definitely not a good or bad, not a right or wrong. Again, long-term trends are good to pick up on, but if you're in your peak week before a marathon and your fully rested HRV is 110, during that peak week when you're hitting 70 or 80 miles a week or whatever, your HRV better be in the 70s or 80s, or else you're not training to the level in which you should be to prepare for that marathon. It's okay if your HRV drops pretty low, because the next week you'll have a rest week. It'll come back up to normal and you'll basically super compensate, would be kind of the programming terminology for that. So I'm gonna kind of go back to the beginning. I'll just talk about my watch and what metrics it gives me and kind of how I use them. So from the raw data standpoint, It does give me heart rate. I would say the resting heart rate is pretty accurate on this. Not just I would say. The research shows that most of the raw data from most watches is going to be between 80 and 95-ish% accurate, precise. It's definitely going to depend on the brand. Again, Whoop actually does seem to be overall the best brand out there. But Garmin's still pretty good. Garmin is really known for their GPS tracking. So this watch does GPS. And then resting heart rate, I think, is pretty good. Heart rate variability, also pretty good. Much better if you actually use a chest strap, as Logan alluded to. This will also give me pulse ox. Studies show that the pulse ox percentage of accuracy is not very good, somewhere in the 80s. But the stuff that I really warn people about is not the raw data. Like that stuff, it's probably not precise, but it's probably good enough to where if you're tracking trends, it's going to be fine. The really kind of, in my opinion, maybe not dangerous, but really just useless stuff would be basically like your readiness. Garmin gives, it's called body battery. It basically has some algorithm that includes resting heart rate variability, and then how you slept. So body battery, I think, is just trash. I don't pay any attention to that at all. And then sleep score also, it's cool when you get a high sleep score, but it doesn't really mean anything because sleep is very poorly understood. Sleep score is what basically the designers have deemed to be what's good, and we don't even really know what is good in sleep score. We hear a lot of times about like REM sleep and deep sleep. These are the best types of sleep, but you dig into the sleep literature and you tell me how confident you are in the way that we understand how we should be sleeping, and then you make your own decision. For me personally, I think a sleep score is totally trash. HRV, again, I talked about that. HRV, pretty accurate, but it's not something I'm really going to make changes based on. So HRV, I would still consider raw data, even though there is some algorithm behind it. It's probably good enough to be accurate. And then a lot of watches, I know mine does, will give you like an estimated VO2 max. And from what I've seen, the watches are pretty good between a VO2 max of 45 and 55 milliliters per kilogram per minute. But anything above or below that, it really seems to be pretty poor, because the way that it measures it is basically just your heart rate at a given pace, a given running pace in this example. And although resting heart rate on these devices seems to be pretty good, when you're actually exercising, the heart rate on these is just not good at all. So if you kind of supplement that by wearing the chest strap while doing one of those tests, it will certainly help it, but it's certainly not a replacement for an actual physiological test. However, caveat, not really a caveat, but just an extra consideration, whether or not your predicted VO2 max is accurate or not, probably doesn't really influence what you do anyway. So if you have a low VO2 max, you're going to want to train to get it higher anyway. If you have a high VO2 max and you want to get it higher, you're still going to train to get it higher. So those metrics, pretty inaccurate in my opinion. However, that part doesn't really matter because they're just kind of fun, gimmicky things anyway. So overall, I love my Garmin. I definitely think it's great for some uses. However, my Garmin, it used to influence my training, and that's one reason I feel so strongly about it. But now it doesn't influence anything how I train, unless it's like giving me my pace during running or something like that. You got any more thoughts, Logan?
No, honestly, I forgot that a lot of those other variables existed
Mm-hmm.
because I pay so little attention to
Mm-hmm.
them. I think my watch gives me similar, like my percent recovery, and it'll be like, oh, I'm 80% recovered. But yeah, most of these variables, they use an unknown algorithm that compares a whole bunch of different other variables that may or may not be accurate, such as the HRV, sleep, the things that Trace already discussed, to compile this other variable that's kind of like multiplying two inaccurate things that just make something, it's like, why would we use that? It's just even more inaccurate. So yeah, I completely agree with what you said. I think like HRV and maybe looking at are like the way the watch tracks sleep, but I probably wouldn't use like the sleep score, for example.
Yeah. one of the biggest things I want to address, I'm not really against this stuff. I did my master's thesis using heart rate variability, and that really just exposed me to really just how nuanced you have to be to actually understand this stuff, and moreover to actually use it. And it's just really not as practical as people think that it is. Even if you use it correctly, I still don't think that it's better than subjective scores or even just good programming. So again, this is a strength and conditioning field. If you're in the medical field, this stuff can be super, super important, can save lives, whatever it may be. One of the big things that kind of fired me up, kind of made me revisit the literature on this, was I've just been seeing commercials for Whoop. Again, Whoop is probably the best device out there for this, but the commercial basically claims that you have a wearable coach on your wrist at all times. And that just fires me up, because that's one of the most arrogant things that you could say. The fact that you think that your watch is going to be better than a coach at helping you figure out what workout to do is just absolutely ridiculous. Best case scenario, you had an expert exercise physiologist, an expert strength and conditioning coach, analyze your data, and then make a workout program, basically create an algorithm that is going to tell you what to do. Even that is so many layers removed from having your own coach, even if it's just like a lower level coach, just like a general personal trainer helping you figure out what to do. This technology is never going to have the capacity to replace a good coach. So yeah, that's a little rant. That definitely got me fired up though. Have you seen that commercial, Logan?
I have, yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on that? Did that make you mad too?
Honestly, I typically just skip it, I'll be honest with you. So I had never thought that in depth, but when you put it like that, it definitely kind of fires me up a little bit. Like, it's not going to be a coach, it's not going to be better than a coach, because it almost goes back to like the ice bath conversation. We can have all this data, but it really depends on how the athlete feels. If the athlete feels good, why do we care whether or not the ice bath worked or not, or whether or not we have a high HRV or a readiness score, body battery, whatever? If the athlete feels good, let's go for it.
Yep, I agree. That'll be a whole podcast for another time. I know I have a friend who's a big believer in this stuff. I actually talked to him on the phone for an hour yesterday. Good friend, he's in the Army, really good athlete, really good hybrid athlete. So maybe we'll have to do a little debate on this stuff. So that being said, Logan, I'll let you make the closing remarks and close us out, and then we'll get rolling.
Yeah, well, if you have any questions that you want us to debate next time, feel free to drop a comment. We would love to start getting some comments to encourage our direction one way or the other. So if you have a good question, let us know. If you, like Trey said at the beginning, if you haven't listened to the first episode, feel free to go back and listen to the first one. We had a lot of really good debates there, a lot of really good questions. And yeah, we'll see you next time, maybe the next week or so.
Yep, sounds good. Follow Stronghold Health and Performance and Alterra Training. Right now we're separate entities. We're talking about kind of making a joint podcast just like this, because we love doing it. Let us know if that's something that you would like to see, if you would like to see us join forces in a more formal capacity, or if you kind of like the variation, you kind of like the Stronghold versus Alterra. Just let us know. All right, thanks guys.